over the past year, I have entered this strange world of delivery, and it is really, really hard. Much, much harder than I thought it would be. Within the public sector itself, there is a strange culture of non-delivery. And it strikes me that in the junior ranks of people working for our government and for our government agencies, people are given three powers. They're given the power to say no, they're given the power to delay, and they're given the power to screw up. And people are only human, so it's no surprise really if they do all three of those things. How do we empower people in junior positions within our public institutions to actually do things?
Our public services will face some significant challenges going into a period of time where expenditure is cut as opposed to expenditure increasing. At the heart of this will, I hope, come a debate about what is value in public services. And I think over the last decade, we have become obsessed by outputs as opposed to value. The public sector is about to face the same crunch that the private sector went into 2 years ago. There will be less cash in the public sector, in our public services. As UK PLC has shown over the last 2 years, it doesn't have to be about sacking people, it doesn't have to be about losing jobs, but it requires a collaboration between employee and employer. And I am worried that that desire to collaborate has not shown itself in the public sector yet.
I think the presumption at the moment is that value and delivery won't have to alter very much because nothing else is going to alter very much. Half the public, 52%, expect more of the state than they do of God, and they are in for a very big disappointment. What I want to focus on very briefly are the potential benefits of recession and of cutbacks. I think we're going to have to move to a more civic model in which citizens get more directly involved in at least some services. It's rather ironic that the undesirable, the inefficient, the anachronistic appear still to be the only items that are sacrosanct. We're going to have to make sacrifices. My case would be that the first items to go should be the harmful and the pointless.
I think we need to have a proper, full, intelligent debate about what is and isn't the function of the state. I think that's where we've got to start. Over the last decade, we've seen a massive accretion in public expenditure, and I've seen it directly myself. And much of that has been around what you would largely call, for want of a better generic expression, to promote social inclusion. Frankly, if you were a young couple with a large mortgage worrying about whether your job was going to be there next week living in Chatham or Chelmsford, you would be jumping up and down with fury if you saw how some of that money had been spent. There will be less money for public services. Probably there should be less money for public services than there has been hitherto.
Around about 1979, we went into a big project nationally, which was, let's take our least successful sector. What would that be? That would be manufacturing. And let's try and remodel all our successful sectors, like public services, like education, like health, etc., etc. Let's try and remodel them to be more like our least successful sector. Wouldn't that be clever? And that's been our project over the last 30 years, including introducing managerial systems which are based on a caricature of the managerial systems in the private sector. So what happens is there's a phrase which gets used about some way of managing in the private sector. Some Secretary of State hears about it over a dinner party when they're desperate for a new policy. And the following day, they go in and try to get their civil servants to implement it, basically on a keyword search of what might this mean if we started trying to do such and such. And so you get a lousy version of it introduced. But it seems that if something doesn't work in the private sector, then the solution is to try it out in the public sector. And if you can't make it work anywhere, then put it into the health service. I think we need to stop routinely denigrating our best sector, because that's what we've been doing publicly for a long time now.
So what we have is a culture where there is no exit. Stanley Carnes was the former CEO of Dixon's, took over as chairman of an NHS trust, and they had a party. Why don't we have a celebration, a party for people who've worked here for 25 years? So they held this party most of the people who turned up, none of the senior people had ever met. So if we don't deal with exit, if there are no consequences for poor performance, and indeed no consequences for great performance, then we have a situation where the social loafing is likely to continue. In fact, it will continue. And therefore the standards will get lower and lower. And even the great people will have to fight very hard and be very much dependent on their own internal resources in order to find motivation to carry on.
I think we should go straight to questions from the audience. So does anybody have one?
The standard of contributions was really excellent, so I'd like to thank everybody for that. Given the cuts that we need to see made in our public services over the coming years, I wonder whether the panel would agree that the Pareto principle could be applied to see a lot of benefit to our services without necessarily having to see too much restriction on the cuts that we have to make.
Okay, thank you.
I just wanted to ask the panel their views on what they thought about the size and scale of the public sector and particular institutions, and how much of that is a factor. If we're talking about organisations being operated by people, the bigger the organisation, the more alienated you feel from the bureaucracy, etc. And echoing Martin's experience at a personal level, I found my primary school experience exceptionally good. It's a effectively small business. Everybody knows everybody knows the customers, everybody knows the teachers. My eldest daughter's just gone to secondary school. I feel like I've lost complete visibility on what's going on. She's probably delighted about that, but I wonder whether there's an issue around the size and scale.
First of all, about the size of public services and about the size of the state. I mean, as I said, I think we need a debate about what is actually the legitimate sphere of activity of the state. But I think there's a tipping point in the size of public services. And I think that tipping point was probably arrived at in about 2006 between adequacy of capacity and funding and then it going too far.
The gentleman very kindly congratulated the panel on the quality of the panel. I also congratulate the quality of the questions as well. On the Pareto point, I think that's absolutely spot on, and it's going to be a very tough thing to do because there are a lot of jobs that exist. Jobs exist because the jobs need to exist.
We're at quite a cathartic moment in the changes that need to happen, and it's presenting quite a big crisis for the left and for the right. The Conservative instinct is to look back to the 1980s and to the manufacturing model, age of austerity, and you saw how George Osborne and others slipped into it. But for the left, it's even worse. In the past 2 years, the HR departments and other people in major companies have succeeded in working with the people they employ to achieve one of the biggest redistributions of work to try and keep people in work.
What worries me is the lack of joined up thinking for the dispossessed, the children that Nick looks after who don't have pushy parents or who have very, very bad parents, and how those of us in the community, if you like, can meaningfully help those children. And I'm wondering whether some marvellous alliance between the Mind Gym and Doncaster Council and creating some sort of mentoring scheme for those people who are not so at the margins, because it seems to me that part of what atrophies in the public sector is isolation, profound silos, profound isolation. Where there is nothing joined up, there is nothing created.
What I want to start with in any client is its language, because that language has been corroded and corrupted by first big ideas, free-floating big ideas borrowed from that hinterland of free thinking and business books. Second, by the sort of pressure of the ideas of central government. And thirdly, by the language of business itself. What people in the public sector seize on is crappy, old, discredited bongo language because it sounds nice. And people seize on language that describes levers which don't have any wires attached in the public sector.
In terms of innovation, yes. I mean, down times are great times for innovation. They focus the mind wonderfully. But let's be really careful about what that innovation is about, because if the innovation is about yet more clever use of irrelevant words, yet more stuff that sounds like it might make a difference but actually is totally irrelevant, then we've wasted an opportunity.
So it just remains for me to thank Julia and her team at Editorial Intelligence for organising such a fascinating event. You were great, the panel were great. Thanks also to Mind Jim, Reed and our hosts, Cass.